Automated Creative are on a mission to reinvent advertising using artificial intelligence. We're a small team of startup folk who are really changing the way that advertising works. In the last few years, we've worked with brands like Adidas, Samsung, Diageo, Reckitt, KFC, Pernod Ricard, Bose, Unilever, GSK, Mondelez, the list goes on. And we are looking for account management talent. So if you know anyone who is kind of obsessed with creativity, ads, AI, and account management, if you could get them to email Rhoda at automatedcreative.net. That's Rhoda, RHODA, at automatedcreative.net. And I will love you forever. On with the show. Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a podcast about the future of marketing. Every week or so, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing some of our industry's leaders. And this week is no different. I'm on a call with Joseph Harper, who is e-commerce marketing manager, Western Europe at Kellogg Company. Joseph, whichever you prefer. I just can't get used to calling you Joseph, but I kind of feel like. But if you could introduce yourself to the audience if they don't know who you are and what you do and haven't already seen you on Advertisers Watching Ads, where we've worked before.
We have, yeah. Thanks, Tom. And Joe's fine. Hi. So Joe Harper, I work for Kellogg's. Tom's explained my current role. Looking after marketing for e-commerce in Kellogg's Europe. Prior to that, I've been at Kellogg's for 7 years, that role for 2 years. 5 years prior to that, I was social lead for the UK and Ireland Kellogg's business. And prior to that, I worked for Bet365, sports gambling company, which people who are into sports will probably know. And I did a couple of roles there. The last one I did was, again, a social kind of content creation and lead role. Prior to that, I worked in customer retention. So lots of sports betting expertise, and then onto cereal, which is completely different. So that's me in a nutshell.
And so how did you make the move from social to ecom? Obviously very closely related these days, but a few years ago, they were different parts of the marketing world.
Yeah, it's the digital word that's the anchor, I guess. I had a very good relationship with my previous manager, who was the marketing director here in the UK. And Kellogg's goes through these kind of business restructures every few years, where they look at the future and say, okay, we set up to tackle the new and exciting and growing areas of growth for our business. And we hadn't ever had a European ecom function prior to this latest restructure. We decided we needed one. So this is pretty much 2 years ago on the dot that it kicked in. And my experience with creating content for digital platforms, understanding kind of like new ways in which to measure and optimize content and engagement and other elements of digitalization were seen as the right set of skills to bring into this role. It is very different, but there are some kind of similarities, as you say. So, optimization, consumer experience, and then, equally as well, when you work for a big company like Kellogg's, a lot of the work, almost most of the work, to be honest, is understanding and developing internal processes to kind of get value out of what we do. So instead of creating 100 different pieces of content for 100 different channels, even though I don't want to contradict myself because I do like the idea of right content, right channel, but in some instances, static lifestyle imagery of a beautiful bowl of cereal on the table, for example, how can we use that across other channels and maximize our investment and kind of share creative wealth throughout the business? A lot of that is kind of what I do nowadays. And then obviously data as well, data interpretation to prove results and engage internal stakeholders, amongst hundreds of other things that I won't go into on this very informal chat.
So if someone wanted to follow in your footsteps, a student just out of uni really wants to make a big impact in the industry, what would your advice to them be?
It's something that I say quite often. I'm just looking out of our office window at the UTC Media City College, which is college for 14 to 18 year olds. And I've done a few talks there with their students. big businesses can get massive immediate value out of students who are just out of uni or even just out of college. To be honest, I remember a great example is Lab Bible, which is a business based here in Manchester originally. I know Ari and the founder really well. And I remember when they set up their Instagram channel, they hired two 16-year-olds straight out of school to run their Instagram. The reason being is that young people are more in touch with digital platforms, social media, and basically what engages consumers and the right kinds of content to live on those platforms. And what I tell businesses like Kellogg's and others that I speak to, and young people who are looking for their first step, is there is an immediate value that these people can add to their platforms. We've recently been working in direct to consumer, and we've kind of like a startup mentality. It's kind of sat outside of the Kellogg's brand. I won't go into it in too much detail, but we've got an apprenticeship program here at Kellogg's, and the young lady that's was part of the apprenticeship program, who's worked with us on this program, has done a far better job of moderating the channels, creating social content, thinking about how to engage our consumers than anybody else in the business, including myself, could have done, because she is right in there as a target consumer. She knows what works. These platforms develop so quickly. If you think about TikTok and everything else that's coming down the pipe. So I would say to students who don't necessarily know exactly what they're going to do long term, you can really go into interviews and apply for roles in big organizations. And if you perhaps cover that point that I've just made around the fact that you can add an immediate value to this big company, then they'd be fools to not consider you for the role. So yeah, don't think that you're a million miles off becoming an important part of a big business, because your youth and your your natural consumption of digital content can be of immediate value to a company like Kellogg's or any other company, to be honest.
So if that's your advice for would-be followers in your footsteps, what is the all-round bit of marketing advice that you cherish and give most often?
Well, it's quite a controversial one. And to be honest, there'll be people at Kellogg's who don't agree with this, but I will say it anyway. We focus a lot on ROI in marketing, return on investment. It's the key metric and the key performance indicator, obviously, of your investment and of how you're doing. And I get that, and I agree with it. Where businesses make mistakes, in my opinion, is solely focusing on ROI as the pure be-all and end-all for how well something has worked or is working. What with digital specifically in this instance, although you could apply it across other verticals, but speaking about digital, there are so many other deliverables and values that initiatives and processes and projects can deliver outside of immediate short-term impact on sales. Efficiencies, what I mentioned at the start of the call. If you're a business, and I'm making these numbers up, this is not reflective of Kellogg's, obviously, but if you're a business that's spending £10 million a year in a market on developing, like I say, content, images, videos, if you can find more effective ways, and this is going to be a theme of everything I'm going to talk about on this podcast, if you can find more effective ways to get that content and it works better and drives you a better ROI, you're not just delivering that ROI, you're delivering massive cost efficiencies for your organization. And so that profit and loss at the end of the year is impacted more greatly by your ability to find more sufficient and efficient ways of generating content. And that's just one example, thinking about the long-term benefits and impacts of investments that you're making now. Again, with companies like Kellogg's, you are very much shackled to your day-to-day, month-to-month and year-on-year performance. And again, I get that, the nature of the industry and the structure and the type of our business. But if you can find a way to present the positive impact that your efforts and projects are having on the long-term health and equity of your brand, essentially, then again, you could argue doing a more important job. And there are loads of other pieces to it as well. A lot of the projects that I work on are for multiple markets. across Europe. And, it'd be very easy for us to focus on the UK as our biggest ecom market in Europe. But if all of the strategy and content and practices that I'm implementing are too UK centric, then and aren't considerate of the cultural nuances that make Europe the most beautiful and vibrant region in the world, in my opinion, then you're not, again, if you can consider all of those pieces up front when you're developing strategy and show the importance of that and the impact and the utility and adoption throughout all the markets of your ideas and your central strategies, then again, I think that's a massive value to businesses and something that, again, falls by the wayside because of this relentless obsession around ROI. Hopefully that makes sense, Tom.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with MadFest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from MadFest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com. Well, we need to move things speedily along and we need to get to the title of the podcast, which is your shiny new object, which you confessed yourself isn't shiny and new, but it's going to be new to you. And you've chosen it as your thing that represents the future of the industry. And it's user-generated content. So something that was around when I first got into the industry and doesn't seem to have gone away. So it's pretty new in terms of the whole history of advertising, but why is it important to you now? Why have you chosen this as your shiny new object?
Yeah, and I apologize in advance because it isn't shiny and new and everybody will know what it is. But what I think is still a massively untapped area for big businesses is truly understanding the value and the part that UGC can play for your business. And again, it's linked to everything that I've talked about in this podcast. We've had I've done a number of tests of content where we've had very heavily designed, very expensive agency developed creative, which has been shackled to all of our compliance guidelines, which again I know are important. When it's gone live on a platform, you can then compare it to when you've put a piece of user-generated content live in the same environment with the same media spend to the same audience, and the engagement rates, the engagement rate and the kind of how well it's received and the sentiment that it receives from consumers. The UGC absolutely knocks spots off the highly designed piece of content. And now that we're in a position where anybody can pick up a mobile phone and create fantastic content naturally to represent a brand or a particular initiative, I think the future will continue to move more and more towards using user-generated content as the bedrock of your content strategy. And that's not necessarily influencer marketing, which is obviously very well established and a bit messy as an industry, if you ask me. Giving you an example, Pringles, one of our biggest brands, there's over 100 pieces of content a day, or there certainly was when I was working in social, being created with the hashtag Pringles tag associated with it. Some of this content, unprompted, off brief, just purely capturing the mindset and the sentiment of the creator at that moment, was absolutely incredible. I've got some wonderful examples. I was looking at them yesterday. And if that was the kind of content, if we could find a way to embed that ongoing as an always on content stream for our brands and our products long term, there is no way in a million years we would be spending the time and the resource and getting the headaches that we get from going through scrutinous, rotating, creative brainstorming and creation processes with these big advertising agencies that we have, who have a job to do for us, don't get me wrong, but and it just works so much better, and the consumers appreciate so much more the that content when it's put in front of them on the variety of platforms that are available. And not every brand that's going to listen to this is going to be getting 100 pieces of user-generated content a day, granted. But for big businesses, I don't even feel like we're on the first page of what we could do if we truly integrated user-generated content within our strategy. I'm really passionate about that.
So I think that's a valid argument. But the thing that we come to a lot as a business is really helping brands understand what makes them different to the category. Like, we have a big thing always saying, like, we hate best practice. Best practice is copying. If everyone's copying each other, no one's marketing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I totally agree. And yeah, thanks for sharing the data point that the UGC outperformed like the beautiful, stylized, expensive agency thing. Mm-hmm. But is it the fact that it's user-generated content, or is it the fact that it's not studio content that matters? So, for example, if you'd done like an animation, which was equally as expensive but labored, if no one else is doing animation, then the animation stands out. So, is it because it's done by a real person, or is it because it's not the norm? And the exciting thing is doing the thing that's not normal, because that's the thing that makes you stand out.
You really smart reflection. I always say, that my one marketing tip was going to be that there's not a one size fits all rule when it comes to marketing strategies, and it depends on your brand, depends on your audience, depends on what you're communicating and what your ambitions are. There's not a standard rule of thumb, in my opinion, when it comes to marketing, because it's so ethereal and how it relates to people. I think the examples that I was looking at when I kind of put together this proposal for the business were, very specific. I just think that, I don't know really, you've thrown that question at me, Tom. It's a really good one though. I don't think it's necessarily to do with the format of the asset. I just think it's to do with, I just think that as human beings, we can consume and process information that we see on our mobile screens and PC screens, laptop, tablets, whatever, so quickly now, we don't realize how quickly we judge and have an opinion on what it is that we're looking at. And I just think that naturally created content, which is quite clearly been created by a real person in that moment, spontaneously, it just naturally engages and creates a positive reflection from the viewer, far more than when you see something which has quite clearly been scrutinized and, optimized and iterated. And I don't know, I think a really heavily branded animation, there's a very specific time and a place for that. For example, in an digital out-of-home placement outside of a store, I think, you don't want to see a piece of UGC necessarily in that space. But particularly for social platforms, I definitely think that's the way to go. And I think it's more just because of the reaction that it triggers with the person who's viewing it and how much they can relate to it. Perhaps it's the relatability, I don't know. But a good question, mate.
Well, Joe, we're at the end of the podcast now, so we're going to have to leave it there. If someone wants to get in touch with you to talk about UGC or anything else, how would you like them to do that?
Yeah, possibly via LinkedIn as opposed to my work email, which people seem to be able to find. But yeah, LinkedIn private messages would be the best one, because that's when I'm.
And what makes a killer LinkedIn message to you to get a reply?
Well, great question. I'd say personalizing it to have relevance to my brands and my categories, and if it's to do with e-commerce, then the retailers that I play in, so core grocery retailers in the UK and in Europe, and FMCG case studies as part of the pitch, as hard as that is often to provide, I appreciate, but that's what will stand out versus the other hundreds of messages that you get across the platforms,
That's great advice. Joe, thank you so much.
Cheers, Tom.
Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the Shiny New Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.